But we are apparently live. I usually like to double check it just to make sure. We're a little bit early. How are you guys doing? Hope everybody's having a sufficient day. It's been a long, strange trip for me. Okay, we are live. Let me just go on here and check the audio while we're... Okay. Beautiful. Yeah. I, like many other projects, this started as something I thought I could tackle in maybe like a week or two. And the reason why I'm focused on Mindhunter specifically has to do with my interest in the Israel Keyes case, which has been the subject of this stream for the last, I don't know, 6 weeks or something like that. Oh, thank you. Ben Tanya, I think that's how we're pronouncing that. Always good to have validation. I always fear that I'm just going to be like talking into nothingness and that my audio is bad. But so the connection between Mindhunter and the Israel Keyes case is that at a point in speaking to the FBI agents that were interviewing Keyes, he told them that it was essentially like his favorite book. But the actual, I couldn't find like any sort of extended audio of him talking to the agents about Mindhunter. And I should also back up here a little bit. So you get so deep in the weeds that you think like everybody is following along with you, but you might not know what Mindhunter is. And the thing that's fascinating about Keyes' affinity for this book is that Mindhunter is a autobiographical account by a guy named John Douglas, who we'll explore in depth in this stream. Yes. It has definitely taken a left turn since I started covering Keyes. So, and Douglas is one of the original FBI profilers. The whole practice of treating serial killers as like a different breed of murderer and trying to understand their psychology started in like the late 70s with a group of people at the behavioral science unit at the FBI, including John Douglas and a bunch of other people that later became famous from writing books and doing speaking stuff, like Robert Ressler and I'm forgetting the third guy's name at this time, but anyway, they all wrote a bunch of books that became extremely influential, but none more influential than Mindhunter, which was later turned into a series in 2017 that you may have seen that ran 2 seasons, and people are still angry that it didn't run more. It was a pretty cool show. I watched, I believe, the first season. And essentially what the book talks about is how they developed the criteria for looking into serial killers, what they look for, the different categories they use, and how they created these behavioral profiles that they would assist local law enforcement with in actually capturing serial killers. So the fact that Israel Keyes, this like most modern of serial killers, I think in a sense, like maybe like the last real serial killer of the old school golden age variety of serial killer, that he thought that this was his favorite book is pretty significant. So I think the best source for this that impacted me the most was Maureen Callahan's book, American Predator, which is about Israel Keyes. And just over halfway through the book, there's a fascinating excerpt that I'll read to you now that covers Keyes' affinity for Mindhunter and what he got out of it, how he saw it, and in his own words, describing the effect that Mindhunter had on him. The other thing that Keyes mentioned that I don't know that gets into in this excerpt that we're going to read is that he wasn't like a real big book reader. So the fact that he even liked a book is sort of significant, but that he identified so deeply with Mindhunter is, well, the basis for the original question that started me out on this whole adventure, which is just why? Like, what is it about that book that connected with him? And is there something buried in the book that I wasn't aware of? Because I had read it before, because it's also connected to the John Benet Ramsey case. It's connected to a lot of cases because it's one of the best true crime selling books of all time. But hopefully this layout works great for you guys, but I've got it bookmarked here to the beginning of the section. And there's about a page before we really get into the Mindhunter stuff that's just going to sort of set up where the case is at this point. If you don't know, Keyes was a serial killer that killed at least a handful of people, including one up here in Alaska, a young woman named Samantha Koenig, who was a coffee barista. And his signature or modus operandi is pretty unique and very strange. He's just a totally unique among serial killers. So this first little bit, we'll set up the context of where the case was. Liz Oberlander and her team had spent 2 days dismantling the shed Samantha had spent her last moments in, searching for evidence of blood, hair, here we go, fingerprints, fibers. Despite the near month her corpse had been left inside and then later made up, hair French braided, underarm shaved, photographed for ransom, subject to necrophilia before being dismembered, still they found nothing. Adding a little context here, the Keyes sent a ransom photo of Samantha Koenig to her father and the police asking for money. And in the photo, she was made up to look like she was alive, but she was actually dead. Same with his pickup truck. The magnitude was sobering. The few interviews Keyes gave seemed at first hubristic. Most of the case agents thought Israel Keyes had to be, to some degree, exaggerating, no more. So what she's picking up on here is the fact that Keyes left virtually no physical evidence in the shed that he killed this woman in or in his truck, which he transported her in. The Bureau's top criminal profilers were at a loss. The only thing they could tell the team was that Keyes was one of the most terrifying subjects they had ever encountered. There's no precedent for a serial killer with this MO. No victim type, no fixed location for hunting, killing, and burying. Putting thousands of miles between himself and his victims, caches buried all over the United States. He avoided detection through travel. Travel. They thought about how onerous travel itself could be, booking flights, clearing post 9/11 security and searches, hoping a flight isn't delayed or canceled, doing the paperwork involved in renting a car, and then relying only on paper maps, no Garmin satellite or Google, checking into a hotel or setting up a campsite, filing for hunting and fishing license, to say nothing of successfully finding a victim or victims while trying to retrieve some cache buried months or years ago, the locations only in his head, then expertly disposing of his victims' remains and leaving no evidence behind. The sheer efficiency in time management Keyes displayed was staggering. So adding a little bit more context here, Keyes didn't use digital devices. He would take the batteries out of cell phones and stuff like that to try to leave no digital footprint. And the subheading of Callahan's book is something like the most meticulous serial killer, which we had a discussion about last week with Parker from Crime Cult. And I think it's maybe a little bit more complicated than that, but he certainly did have some pretty unique tactics. And the time period here is about 2012. So breaking apart a cell phone and removing the battery was something the team hadn't seen before either. For Cat Nelson, those dark spots in his history, the hours that his phone gave off no signal, would be a tell. That's when Keyes was doing something. Then there was the driving, the ability to stay awake without the aid of drugs, just his Americano coffees and soaring adrenaline, moving through 5 states in as many days. Until Samantha, Keyes had left no digital trail, no cell phone or credit card activity. Until Samantha, he swore he'd never killed in his own backyard. Decades of mayhem, geographical boundaries unknown. If an Israel Keyes existed, someone even more diabolical would follow. They needed to understand the forces that built Israel Keyes, the first sui generis serial killer of the 21st century, just meaning totally unique. Some agents like Steve Payne stuck to traditional investigative methods. The interviews Ganaway was conducting with Heidi, searching through financial records, computers, date books, and other journals, interrogations with Keyes himself. For other agents, Jeff Bell, Jolene Godin, and now Ted Holla and Colleen Sanders, 2 FBI special agents who were starting to research Keyes down in Washington State, the few serial killers referenced The few serial killers Keyes referenced were a source of fascination, and they hoped insight. These agents began reading and watching every book, film, or TV show Keyes had consumed, building little libraries in their respective field offices and comparing notes. So now we're going to start hitting on the books in question by the profilers. Keyes had told investigators that there were two texts he studied closely, both written by pioneering behavioral profilers in the FBI. Dark Dreams, Sexual Violence, Homicide, and the Criminal Mind by Roy Hazelwood, that was the third guy, I forgot his name, and Mindhunter, Inside the FBI's Elite Serial Crime Unit by John Douglas. In turn, the model for Jack Crawford in The Silence of the Lambs. I don't know about you guys, but Silence of the Lambs is like one of those films that I've watched easily over 10 times. It's incredible. It's just got so many great elements, and even the director's commentary is worth checking out if you haven't. Bell hadn't read Dark Dreams before, and it was a revelation. Hazelwood wrote of specific deviations of sexually sadistic criminals, and Keyes had nearly all of them. No criminal record prior to arrest, a seemingly happy domestic life, compulsive driving. This stood out to Bell. It had seemed so specific to Keyes, yet Hazelwood explained that this was a shared tendency among psychopaths, feeding an overarching need for control, freedom, and constant visual stimulation to counter the boredom they so often feel. Another passage nailed Keyes. The sexual offender is never fully inactive, Hazelwood wrote. He may not be acting out against a specific victim, but he will be making plans, selecting new targets, acting out against other victims, or gathering materials. He's never dormant. And this is something that we've talked about a bit on the stream. There's been some speculation about whether or not Keyes was like an amphetamine user. It may just be his natural personality. And one point that Parker made in their discussion last week that I thought was really apropos is that these guys are so unique that you can't really bring the same sort of set of expectations you have into how they're going to act in like an interview or in any other sort of facet. Keyes was a cluster bomb. Investigators were learning that some of his tactics were borrowed from different predecessors, reconstituted for the modern age. Ted Bundy, who Keyes called his great hero, killed all over the country. James Mitchell Mike DeBartolome, the basis for Buffalo Bill and The Silence of the Lambs, kept at least one kill kit. John Robert Williams was a long-haul trucker who killed in one state and left bodies in another. Dennis Rader, the BTK, bind, torture, kill, strangler, posed at least one of his victims in the basement of his church, tied up in sexually degrading positions. And I think we just got another couple of passages here that I want to get to, and then we'll move on to some other multimedia delights. Before his death in 2016, Hazelwood spoke about Keyes. Hazelwood's decades of service had left him with a cynical view of the FBI's truthfulness in general. Can't blame him. And he believed stranger abductions are far more common than the Bureau insists. This is a fascinating little insight. He was convinced that the proliferation of hardcore pornography, so easily and anonymously accessible online, has contributed to increasingly sadistic crimes and murders. He believed that technology, the mainstreaming of violent pornography, advances in ever faster travel, and an overall culture of misogyny from politics to entertainment would only continue to breed more aberrant and dangerous criminals. He made this prediction in 2001. I think that has definitely changed since then. One book that I would definitely recommend if people are interested in these sort of deep lore serial killer things is Jarrett Kobeck actually wrote 2 books about the Zodiac killer a couple of years ago. And they're really both fascinating. One sort of more just about the Bay, like the sort of general vibes of the Bay Area at the time. And one is a sort of a deconstruction of a process to find a serial killer. But he talks about how like nowadays the sort of time element of the serial killer has been sped up towards like all mass murderers now, people that kill all in one shot, a bunch of people, versus back then it was spread out for whatever reason. It's just really fascinating insight. Excuse me. Keyes, Hazelwood agreed, was among the top criminally organized minds he'd ever encountered. If you don't know about the whole organized, unorganized thing, one of the major criteria that FBI uses for serial killer classification. But Keyes should not be mistaken as lacking emotion. Far from it, Hazelwood said. Psychopathic sadists as Keyes have pushed their emotions down so deep, only extreme acts evoke any feeling whatsoever. It's why their crimes, horrific even in the beginning, must escalate, typically from the torture of small animals to rapes and murders, increasingly elaborate in planning and realization. Palpable gratification only comes through multiple victims and greater suffering. This is the last passage here. Not all psychopaths are serial killers, but all serial killers are psychopaths. The latter, lust-driven serial murderers, share a common denominator: how they think. For example, Keyes had once considered becoming a police officer. And when asked why, Keyes said, "What better way to hunt for victims? A police officer pulls you over on the side of the road late at night." And I wanted to get to that whole thing because one of the things we're going to discuss later on in this little spiel is the sort of affinity and connection between law enforcement and serial killers. If you don't know, law enforcement has like one of the highest rates of psychopathy amongst its ranks. It attracts that sort of personality type. Yeah, so I was thinking what to do for the next portion here. And I think like one of the best things to do would just be to sort of like let you hear Douglas speak a little bit. I've got a couple different clips that I want to play. And the first one is to give you a sense of this guy's personality. And one of the inescapable things in me reading this book and really sort of focusing on the text is like how self-absorbed Douglas is, like how much high regard he has for himself. And that really kind of colors the way that the rest of this material is going to come off, because you have to sort of understand the minds of the people in the FBI that created this stuff, right? What was the FBI like in the 70s and 80s? What was their sense of self and mission? So, yeah, I mean, Markeef, I'm not really sure. It seems, I think one of the things that's like sort of like a tragedy in this whole thing is that serial killers aren't better studied. Like there really hadn't been any sort of rigorous study at all of serial killers until the Douglas Behavioral Science Unit sort of stumbled into it bass backwards. Because one thing that's another sort of insight into the personality of Douglas is that he didn't start interviewing serial killers as some sort of research project. He did it because he like felt inadequate giving like road presentations in front of experienced police officers when he was like a new FBI agent with no real law enforcement training. So basically all of the data that we have up close and personal with these guys, serial killers, comes through the filter of the FBI. And the FBI is a black box, right? Garbage in, garbage out. You don't really know all the details of their process. But I would say it's a pretty decent assumption. I've cited another really interesting paper in some of my earlier videos called Hungry Like the Wolf. I think you may remember. Other people have talked about it too in the context of the Adelson family in the killing of Dan Markell, the law professor from Florida State, because that whole family was like really creepy. And that paper talks about the language that psychopaths use. And so these people from Cornell have done studies about like trying to detect psychopathy in murderers through like the language they use. And what they found was that murderers generally use more like sense memory type language, like about like experiences like food and sort of everyday type stuff. Whereas non-psychopathic murderers, and there are non-psychopathic murderers, I'd say actually most murderers are, just sort of like a crime of passion, and actually have the lowest recidivism rate, although there's a lot of hanky stuff in that data. But, the ones that aren't actually psychopaths talk more about abstract concepts like God and, religion, things that aren't necessarily like day to day. Douglas was a brick agent. What are you talking about? I'm not sure what brick agent means. Before he got into the behavioral profile thing, he had been a SWAT team sniper, and he had been an agent in some sort of field office for like a couple of years. But that was his impression. That's what he thought. And he talks about that. So it's not like I'm interpreting that. So let's watch a little clip. I want to show you just like a minute or two of this interview that John Douglas did on like a very small podcast. And I was like sort of just enamored with it because it's so demonstrative of his personality. Like he goes on this like random podcast where like one of the guys' mics isn't working, and he just starts totally taking over the conversation. So let's just watch a little bit of this first part of it. I thought this was pretty funny, and it does a good job of like summing up what my words are going to be. It'll take me a long time to try to get to the same sort of level of detail about who this guy is.
We've identified him. So very young in my career, they say, "Hey, John, can you do this? Tell us where he is." I said, "Well, I'll have to get his material." So I go up to headquarters. They provide me all the material, but I don't do it there. The air is too thin at FBI headquarters there. So anyway, I would go down to Quantico, back to Quantico, go up in the library and assess everything. And like with Franklin, I was able to pinpoint the area where he would be in the United States, the city he would be going to. In fact, when I did it with him, I went out to all the offices that Joseph Paul Franklin will be going to Mobile, Alabama. That's where he was a success as a bank robber early in his career. He impregnated a 14-year-old girl, had a baby. And so now that he's in his fugitive status, his common turf.
Does audio sound like it's clipping to anybody else? It kind of sounds clippy to me. It doesn't. I just wanted to show you a little bit of this because it's just such a crazy, weird thing. I sort of was doing something else, listening to it in the background, and just sort of becoming hypnotized because this guy talks for like 90% of this conversation. Like, it's just wild. And it's sort of how he is. Like, I'm just kind of like scrubbing through it so you can see like how he sort of like sucks all the air out of the room, But then there's another really fun clip where, okay, yeah, Tad Lowe. The audio, it wasn't exactly important. It's more just like the general impression of the guy with the, the class ring and the, just he's sort of a vain guy. But okay, I'll pump it up for this next one because I got another really cool clip, which is much more substantial, where we have Douglas and another woman, Ann Burgess, who is the person that really did all of the actual heavy lifting in terms of coming up with the model that they used to interview serial killers. Like, once she heard that Douglas was doing this, she was like, "Oh my God, we have to get funding and do a study because this is like such a unique opportunity." So, but anyway, we also see a clip of the show Mindhunter from 2017 that dramatizes their meeting. So let's play this.
Psychologists using these terms themselves.
And that's where we met. I think you met.
They're talking about how they met. And so this is the scene that shows that process.
So I think we have a clip from the actual Mindhunter show from, it looks like the third episode, in which sort of depicts the first time that you were sort of together discussing this. Do we have that? Can we show that?
When you sent me your notes from the Kemper meetings, I was in a real rut with my new book.
What's your book about?
It's about white-collar criminals, men not so different to your Edmund Kemper.
How do you think the men you study are similar to Edmund Kemper?
Well, first of all, they're all psychopaths. I study captains of industry. IBM, MGM, Ford, Exxon, you name it. And sure, these men all have wives, kids, dogs, goldfish, but not because they stopped being psychopaths. But
I just want to kind of keep, yeah. I just wanted to make sure that I stop it every once in a while because this is a film. I don't want to get the stream taken down. But essentially, what's fascinating to me about is like the meta nature of the fact that she's talking about how there's common traits between like high achieving executives that are psychopaths. Psychopaths make up something like 4% of the population, considering the estimates that you'll see, and the inclination of serial killers. But they're just sort of, she'll explain more, but they're just sort of have different sort of inclinations.
They just had different leanings.
But you think they have the same underlying personality traits?
Well, Kemper shows a total lack of remorse, a lack of inner emotional structure, no ability to reflect on the experience of others.
You saw this in my notes?
It would have been clearer if you'd recorded and transcribed your interviews verbatim, but yeah. Although your project is obviously in nascent stages, it already feels like a clear successor to The Mask of Sanity, which, as you know, is quite a compliment.
Can you repeat that, the mask?
So you're saying you don't think us interviewing these killers is crazy?
Just the opposite. I mean, crazy in the way that anyone with a truly new idea is crazy, but no.
Wow. Okay. That's a relief.
That hasn't really been the feedback we've gotten so far.
So, like, one thing that's really divergent between the story as Douglas tells it and this dramatized version of events is, this guy right here, this sort of aw shucks guy, is playing the role of John Douglas in this show. But it's just so, as you can see, like, that's why I kind of wanted to show you Douglas like in the flesh before we saw this, because he's just not that guy. He's sort of made into like a protagonist character that people can identify with in the show. I think that makes it more effective because John Douglas was like a real asshole, and we'll get into more of that after this.
Actually, this is the only feedback we've gotten so far.
Well, these men are just sitting here, locked up, and we're too afraid of the morality of it to see the far-reaching value of their insights.
Far-reaching in law enforcement.
Into behavioral science, early detection, criminology, you name it.
Wow. Yes. This is what I've been saying the whole time.
Oh, have you?
You obviously need to put this on a more formal footing. It's going to take a lot of time and energy to expand it into a larger project with a specific questionnaire, like their family histories, what their thoughts were on why they did it, when they were aroused during the killings, that sort of thing. Then contrast, compare, and publish.
Publish.
You can't just circulate your findings within the FBI. I mean, maybe even turn it into a book.
A book?
Whoa. We definitely appreciate the vote of confidence, but we weren't even allowed to send you those notes. We can't publicize what we're doing in any way.
Why not?
Our department head gave us weekends only and an office in the basement.
If it sounds like there's a laugh track in the background, this is being shown to like a live audience. So that's why they're reacting. And the other thing that I think is interesting about this, this demonstrates, is like the attitude of the FBI. Like, they were just so not about people freelancing. And in the book, there's a number of instances where Douglas discusses like how he kind of got in trouble at the FBI because, as they said, he had like a blue flame coming out of his ass. Like, he was too much of a go-getter. And even like the fact that he would take on this sort of thing where he'd go and flash his badge and like visit serial killers like Edmund Kemper to interview them is pretty nuts. And not something the FBI was in the business of doing, like, just sort of winging it like that. So it just kind of, again, shows you the personality of Douglas and why that's the one part of this series that sort of never really made sense to me, is that this sort of meek version of Douglas would actually attempt this sort of thing.
So John, it's fair to say you've written quite a few books over the years from this subject matter, but I want to ask you a question a little bit more about, that's dramatized there, but what were you actually looking to do by interviewing the serial killers, by individuals who had this background?
We were getting so many cases at Quantico from students in the class. We're trying to get background information on them, and really the simple formula was why plus how equals who. When you're looking at an on-sub case and you're analyzing a crime scene, we don't know who the who is. Well, let's go talk to the who's. Let's go talk to the people who have perpetrated the crimes, and let's go dig into their files, interview police prior to the interview, look at the correctional records, and then go into the interview. And one thing which is totally different than in the show, because everyone has been asking the tapes. Everyone wants to see the tapes that the Holden Ford character, would have been my character, had done. I only used the tape one time, because when you're dealing in a prison type situation, the trust is not there. They don't trust you, and by having the tape, they're extremely paranoid. And I did.
So one comment that I want to make, and something I thought about in Douglas recounting this, that he would never tape conversations. He just basically would like write notes later after the conversation about what happened, is like how much we're sort of relying on Douglas as like the single point of failure and his memory being accurate for these studies. It just kind of goes to show you how it puts into question how reliable all that data would be, that he, wasn't taping it or taking contemporaneous notes really. And the other thing that's I want to play here is Douglas gets into the exact question we were talking about earlier about like whether or not he intended to do research with these original interviews with serial killers like Edmund Kemper.
Even would not take notes. And the 57-page computerized instrument that was developed, by all of us here, we mostly fill that out before the interview, and we're only going to delve into, again, elements of the victim and the crime. We'd fill out the rest of it after we left the interview, went back to the hotel.
So, Ann, how accepted was this? The formalization of the process, the fact that you were interviewing serial killers, how accepted was it within the FBI and general criminal prosecution?
Well, I can let John talk a little bit about that, but I think it was impressive that it was funded. This was the first time that I had ever had any funding, and so this was really impressive.
And your peers, John?
And yeah.
Like we say, it's better to ask forgiveness than for permission, because when they found this out, why are you doing this? And even though Hoover died in 1972, and this was now in the late 1970s, it's like, again, don't embarrass the Bureau. You're going to make a mistake here. It's going to reflect back on the organization. And the Bureau pretty much too had always been this kind of faceless organization. They want you to be faceless. Now here you're in a position where you're going to be giving an opinion rather than Jack Webb, just the facts man type of thing. Now you're going to be giving an opinion on a case, which direction this investigation should be going. So it just scared the hell out of him.
So I think I have a clip that Dr. Burgess mentioned here from the 4th episode of Mindhunter, where you've actually received your funding. If we could just roll that.
Dr. Carr, I'm aware of your consulting with Bill over the years and your help framing certain psychological concepts with the BSU.
Yes, a handful of times. Special Agent Tench
I
was.
assume.
I thought that he got right into the stuff about how it wasn't research right after this. This clip is just basically depicting how the FBI brass were not happy with the freelancing, which we've already sort of covered. So what my plan here is just to sort of establish the who, what, where, and why of Mindhunter, so that we're all on the same page, and just give you sort of my take, which is what we've already done. And it really is sort of unique in that, in the one sense, like I don't want to put too much blame on him because there really wasn't like a rubric for it. But at the same time, the fact that he was even undertaking that sort of thing just kind of goes to show you how sort of self-centered this guy was. And then when he did actually get into the study that was just funded to the tune of like millions of taxpayer dollars, he can't change his spots. John Douglas, he's just always kind of going to be the same guy where it's all about him, and maybe I'll kind of let the cat out of the bag here, in that one of the things that I really concluded is in reading Mindhunter, and it really took me like a couple weeks to get through this book because I kept picking up stuff where I'd have to go, he'd talk about like the Atlanta child murders, and I'd have to go do some reading on that, or read like a stack of old FBI reports or something like that. But one of my main impressions was like, this guy, John Douglas, his personality is like almost as noxious as the serial killers that he's profiling. Like he's just has all these hallmark characteristics. And that's what we're going to talk about in this next part, is we're going to profile the profiler, because I think it's really fascinating. It's just an inevitable question you have, like, who would even want to sort of hang around with serial killers and like get into their minds? One of the things that Douglas keeps returning to is how, he has to sort of enter the mind of the serial killer to interpret what he sees in the crime scene. And so in that sense, you can see like how there has to be some sort of linkage there. They have to, the personality of Douglas can't be that far removed from that of the people that he's profiling if he can empathize with them to such a degree. And it's really sort of almost a contradiction in terms, because the psychopath essentially has made like an evolutionary bargain or trade-off where like they can't really understand the perceptions of other people. They don't have much of a theory of mind about how other people will react. They're so self-centered, but at the same time, the benefit for them is that they don't care. It doesn't matter what other people are feeling, and that's why they make sometimes great executives, at least in this society we're living in. So the same sort of things can apply to Douglas, of course, and it's just remarkable how, in reading the book, he talks a lot about himself. It's almost like an autobiography with like this whole sidelight of him doing the profiling, and even like his background that we were touched on earlier, like the fact that he was the sniper in the SWAT team, made me think of people like Chris Kyle, the guy that got into the lawsuit with Jesse Ventura, and how he claimed that he was shooting people from the top of whatever the stadium is in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, and just sort of told all these whoppers. It resonated, that personality type, because you can see that John Douglas is like a BSer. And there's a couple really, I'm just trying to think of where to pivot here, because I don't know if, are you guys into like the reading stuff? Because one of the things I was thinking about for this stream is I've been watching another streamer who reads excerpts of stuff, and she's like so good at sort of talking about the material that she's reading and adding context. And I really enjoy books, but I'm just not really, I don't trust my own instincts on that, because I know, YouTube and video is sort of like the dominant thing. But I've got a really interesting article. Maybe what I'll do is just sort of put the article on screen and just sort of discuss my impressions of it and how I found it. So let's do that here. So one of the reasons why this whole thing really interested me is I began working for the public defender in around 2008, and as a paralegal. And one of the first big cases that I investigated involved this guy who had been convicted of a double murder here in Juneau back in the early 80s. And he was like a low functioning guy, and the case is a total mess where a couple in their 60s was stabbed to death in their apartment downtown, and everybody was kind of drunk, and it was just a whole scene. But this guy still proclaims that he's been innocent, and he got sent to prison based on what was known then as hair microscopy evidence. Because Alaska didn't have a crime lab back in the 80s, the FBI stepped in during trial and became the expert witnesses. Since the 80s and 90s, when this sort of hair and fiber evidence was very prevalent and very effective in courts, it's been discredited. There's an internal whistleblower. There's a whole history there. I spent years digging into this kind of stuff because it's fascinating, but there are tens of thousands of cases compromised. And this hair and fiber lab grew up during the same period of time that profiling came about. But the linkage with the Mindhunter book and John Douglas is even stronger than that, in that many of the cases that he talks about in this book were solved with hair and fiber evidence. Like I mentioned, the Atlanta child killer case earlier. I don't know how many people are familiar with that. It's something I've kind of wanted to make a video on for a while, but it's a very involved case where a number of kids were getting murdered in Atlanta. And it was the case that sort of really broke profiling. John Douglas worked on it intensively, came up with all these profiles, and was even in court advising the prosecutors on how to deal with the suspect, a guy named Wayne Williams, who's convicted and is still in prison, on the stand. And his account of his participation in the Atlanta child murders in Mindhunter is kind of a sight to behold. So anyway, I got clued into this really early on, and one of the things that actually really clued me in is there's a New Yorker article by Malcolm Gladwell. It came out in 2007 called Dangerous Minds. It's a very long article, so I don't think I want to get into reading too much of it. But it's a really gripping read because it recounts the entire sort of history of profiling. And the way that he puts it is it's basically like cold reading. If you've ever seen, what's the guy that was just on Joe Rogan, the mentalist guy, or John Edwards, where he talked to like dead relatives or stuff like that. There's lots of different applications for cold reading, but it's like where somebody who's like a huckster will sort of ask leading or wishy-washy questions to somebody to get information out of them, and then sort of tell them something that they've gleaned from this back and forth. And so that's the comparison that Gladwell ultimately makes, is that profiling is kind of like a parlor trick. And I'll put a link to this in the chat. I've got a cached version of it because the New Yorker is paywalled, which is annoying. So if you just want to read it without getting hassled, there's the link. But I definitely recommend it for further reading if you guys are interested in this. There was a passage that I bookmarked here, but I just don't want to get into dwelling on this too much because I think my point has been made. And the other thing that comes across in terms of Douglas's personality in the book is there's a number of like just really noxious aspects of how he acts towards people. He's like one of these practical joke guys who is always like doing these weird, elaborate, sort of nonsensical practical jokes on people, which is a trait that one could very much associate with sociopathy, at least, because it's like sort of really doesn't regard the feelings of other people. Like one example is he's called into a meeting with his wife and her pastor at a church, and he like tells like a really like dirty joke as like a prank. It basically like makes up a story about he met his wife in like a topless bar when she was a go-go dancer or something like that, and it sort of shocked the pastor, obviously. And so he's just like getting weird reactions out of people. One of the other things that I did want to get into in terms of a text that is, we should go over the hair and fiber stuff, because what's really interesting is as I was reading Mindhunter, one of the sidelights I went down was that within the book, he talks about how easy it is for like hair and fiber contamination to happen. And I think maybe if we just read just a couple quick excerpts, it might illustrate the point I'm trying to make. Because again, I'm sort of so in the weeds here that just sort of talking about this is helpful for me to sort of unpack what I'm going to do when I make an edited actual video on this. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to really dig into this guy. And okay, here we go. So let me share the screen for here we go. Mindhunter. Bada bing. Okay. This is really gets into the Atlanta child murders stuff and how important the fiber evidence was, and it also describes the fiber evidence, which I think will be helpful for folks, because me just sort of talking about it extemporaneously can't really fully show you how nutty this stuff is and how it was basically the only physical evidence that was used to convict Wayne Williams of like a bunch of murders. I think he only went on trial for 2, but there was like at least 12 murders that they attributed to him. So, I mean, it's just kind of crazy that some FBI guy looking under a microscope and saying your carpet's the same as the carpet that was found on the victim is enough in a profile, So I think it's worth going through this and just sort of showing you how the sausage was made back in the day. Let me get a quick drink here. So we're picking up here in the middle of the book where this is before the Atlanta child murders. And I want to read this passage because it shows you how an investigation was led astray back in 1979 because of hair evidence that they thought was significant. And you'll see how it sort of develops here. But so this is a murder that was like a really crazy murder where a woman was found like posed and severely mutilated, and the only physical evidence they found was a hair. So traces of semen were found on her body, but DNA typing was unknown to forensic science back in 1979. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or blood traces or skin fragments on her fingernails, which suggested there had been no struggle. The only tangible piece of forensic evidence was a single negroid hair found on the body during the autopsy. That's how they referred to the different types of hair. They had all these, like, I call it like a folk science. Like these FBI guys would just come up with these typologies and different ways of classification. So there was negroid hair, there's mongoloid hair. The names are just so nuts to modern ears. And then Caucasian hair, I think. And so there was like 3 main types. There's just so many questions that one could have about this. Like, for example, what if somebody was mixed race? But anyway, we'll leave that for another day. Okay, so I think that's all we wanted to do there, is just kind of demonstrate that. So we'll pick up here a few pages later. Even though the examination of the body had turned up the negroid hair, I was convinced we were dealing with a white killer. And so here's John Douglas on how black serial killers and how they act versus white serial killers. I can't believe this is real. I think this also was like the basis for like a bunch of different Dave Chappelle bits and other things. But anyway, it's just nuts, the stuff that comes out of this guy's mouth. So very rarely did we see this type of crime, a brutal mutilation murder, cross racial lines. And when we did, there's usually other evidence to substantiate it. There was none in this case. And I had seldom, if ever, seen this kind of mutilation from a black subject. A black former janitor in the building who had never returned his keys was considered a good suspect, but I didn't think it would be him, both because of this behavioral consideration and the fact that some of the tenants would have been sure to notice him. It's just crazy how this guy makes all these assumptions. Anyway, we continue. The negroid hair, by the way, turned out to be unrelated to the murder. The medical examiner's office did a careful procedural investigation and discovered that the body bag used to transport Francine Elvison, the victim's body, to the morgue had previously been used for a black male victim and had not been properly cleaned out between uses. But this does go to show that forensic evidence on its own can be misleading, and if it doesn't fit the investigator's overall impression of the case, it should be looked at carefully before being accepted as proof. There's just so many things one could comment on in this excerpt, including, like, again, John Douglas's hubris and the fact that he's basically saying, like, if the evidence doesn't comport with your profile, yeah, you might want to just toss it out. It's the book is just littered with this kind of stuff, and at a certain point, I had to sort of stop taking notes because it was Just so nuts. So then we'll pick up with the Atlanta child murders, and just a couple quick passages here talking about the fiber evidence. At that time, somebody in the medical examiner's office announced that hair and fibers found on Patrick Baltazar, one of the victims' bodies, matched those found on 5 of the previous victims. So now the FBI is using these carpet fibers to link victims together. These are among the ones I had linked together as having the same killer. So in Douglas's profile, looking at the crime scenes of these 6 victims, this carpet fiber analysis validated John Douglas's profile analysis. The announcement of the forensic findings received wide-scale coverage. And something clicked with me. He, this killer, is going to start dumping bodies in the river. Now he knows they're getting hair and fiber. So now he's talking about the warrant that was obtained to search the eventual convicted murderer Wayne Williams' home. That warrant was obtained on June 3rd. Despite Williams having washed out the car, police found hair and fiber linking him with about 12 of the murders, the exact ones I had profiled as being done by the same killer. The evidence was compelling. Not only did they get fibers linking the bodies to Williams' room and the house and the car, Larry Peterson of the Georgia State Crime Lab matched fibers from clothing some of the victims had worn on occasions prior to their disappearance. In other words, there is a connection to Williams before some of the murders. So they're saying that in outfits the victims had worn before they were murdered, they found those. So apparently the theory is that Wayne Williams had these people in his home or car before they were ultimately murdered. It's just crazy, man. I think I got a couple more here. So this is, I think, interesting to go into because he talks about, we're talking now about Wayne Williams' trial and John Douglas's account of how much he helped. And this was like one of the first major criminal cases, murders, where there's profiling evidence used at all, and especially used in the warrant application. So this is sort of behavioral profiling's debut on the grand stage of the high-profile murder. So here, I just thought this was really worth going over because it recounts, like, in Douglas's own words, how important this fiber evidence and his profile was. And then after we read these few passages, I'll give you my theory on what this actually could have been doing, the reasons why they sort of had to resort to this sort of chicanery. Much of the prosecution's case rested on about 700 pieces of hair and fiber evidence, meticulously analyzed by Larry Peterson and Special Agent Hal Dedman, an expert from the FBI lab in Washington. Okay. During the prosecution's case, Hal Dedman and Larry Peterson had done a masterful job with the hair and fiber evidence, but it was extremely complex stuff, and by its very nature, not a very theatrical presentation. All about how this carpet fiber twists in this direction and that carpet fiber twists in another direction. Ultimately, they matched fibers from all 12 victims to Williams' violet and green bedspread, connected most of them to the carpet in Williams' bedroom, about half of the carpet in the living room, the same number to his 1970 Chevrolet, and in all but one case were able to make a connection to hair from the defendant's German Shepherd, Sheba. It's just amazing how they're able to really nail this guy on all counts with the hair. You know, it works every time. It's just kind of miraculous if you think about it in statistical terms. Okay, there we go. Okay. In her statement to the jury, Williams' attorney, Mary Welcome, held up a thimble and asked them, "Are you going to let a thimble full of evidence convict this man?" And there's so many passages in this book that just blew me away. This is one of them where, you know, in the defense attorney's closing argument, she makes this point about how reliable is this fiber evidence? And the way that the FBI and John Douglas react to it is frankly thuggish, and they should have been charged criminally for what they did here. Are you going to let a thimbleful of evidence convict this man, Wayne Williams? She held up a piece of green carpet from her office, saying how common it was. How can you convict a man because he has green carpet? So that day, some other agents and I went to her law firm. We walked in, went into her office while she wasn't there, and pulled up some carpet fibers. We brought them back and had the experts put them under the microscope and gave the evidence to the prosecution, demonstrating that the fibers from her carpet were completely different from the fibers in the carpet in the Williams home. So they conduct their own freelance experiment here, one that doesn't show anything because it's a one-to-one comparison, no statistical significance, but they barge into this woman's place of business and take carpet fibers. It's just sort of insane. I mean, again, goes to demonstrate the hubris of Douglas and his unit. On February 27th, 1982, after 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict in both murders. Wayne B. Williams was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, which she is serving in the Valdosta Correctional Institution in South Georgia. He still maintains his innocence, and the controversy surrounding Williams has never died down or gone away. If he does ever manage to win a new trial, I am confident the result will be the same. Okay, yeah, and that was it. I just got a couple highlights there. It's just sort of nuts. And, you know, when you've spent a while down this rabbit hole, and again, I'm sure I read this book years ago because it was something that was in the Aether in the John Bonet case because the family had a copy of it in the house. I can't remember, it was laying out somewhere sort of conspicuously. So in that case, you know, let's try to do the same sort of thing, read it and see how it might have related to the personalities of the Ramseys. But in reading it again in this sort of new light recently and like really taking the time to go over the text, it's just sort of shocking. There's so many points in this thing where it's hard to believe. There's one other thing I want to show you guys while I'm thinking about it is just this one passage early in the book, you know, where he's talking about how he did a profile on the Green River Killer as well, the guy from the Seattle area. He killed, you know, like 50 prostitutes. And one thing I want to note is, like, almost every case that this John Douglas guy gets involved in, it's not like it resolves neatly. Like, you either have like the Wayne Williams situation where the conviction doesn't seem very sound. It's based on this like hokey carpet fiber evidence that's since been discredited, or the case doesn't get solved for like 20 plus years. And that's what happens in Green River, who didn't get caught until like the 2000s. And the same thing with BTK, both cases that John Douglas worked on. So you could almost hypothesize that these profiles that Douglas gave may have led the investigators astray. I mean, that's one conclusion that you could make, because in these 2 high-profile cases had almost an identical result, where these sort of bumbling serial killers, BTK and Green River, neither of them exactly a Rhodes Scholar, were able to evade capture for decades after the great profiler John Douglas was on the case. But again, this just totally shows this guy's personality, because he's talking about how once he really got going as a profiler and how active, you know, he's handling about 150 active cases at a time with no backup. He was the only one doing these profiles at the time. Again, single point of failure. And I was on the road from my office at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, about 125 days a year. The pressure was tremendous from local cops, who themselves were under tremendous pressure to solve cases from the community and from the families of victims, for whom I always had enormous empathy, big empathy for the families of all of those prostitutes that got killed. I keep trying to prioritize my workload, but new requests kept pouring in daily. My associates at Quantico, his buddies at the FBI, often said I was like a male whore. I couldn't say no to my clients. You know, I kind of had to sit with this for a second to like really marinate on the implications of what he's saying. Like this, again, is such an off-color joke, but he's just talking about working on all these prostitute murders. And then he's like, oh yeah, I'm just like a prostitute. I have no agency. I can't decide anything for myself. I just do whatever people tell me to do. It's just so, not only does it show you like his sort of callous regard for like people he considers lower than him, but also his general opinion of prostitutes, like, and there's a lot of other indicia on this point for women. He's got a real strain of misogyny. So at this point, I just kind of want to give you what I think might have been happening here with the profiling stuff, because he'll always claim that his profiles were like super accurate. And even to the point where multiple times in this book, he includes in his profile, like what color the car and what make of car the serial killer is going to have. Somebody he has no, they're looking for an unknown suspect, right? And he'll be like, yeah, he's going to be driving like a red Volkswagen Beetle. And I always ask to myself, like, why is the color of the murderer's car significant? It's just sort of, but it's the kind of bizarre detail that the guy puts in, almost as if it's like again, like sort of a parlor trick where he's giving you like extra information to try to validate how great his profiles are. But I'll give you my half-baked theory here. I don't even think it's really necessarily that half-baked, but one of the major trends during this exact era, it's really such a crazy joke, Markeith, that I actually got the updated 2017 version of this ebook because I was like, he must have taken it out, especially because it was released in 2017, right during like the Me Too era. But no, it's still in there. It's like, holy shit, this guy is nuts. There's just so many things like that. Like, you want to think that your eyes are betraying you with something like this, but there's just so many things that came up like that eventually I sort of was like, yeah, I think this guy's a psychopath. I really do. But so as John Douglas was working on creating the behavioral profiling unit, and he started at the FBI in the early 70s, but didn't really get going on the profiling unit until like the late 70s when it started to get formalized. This exact period of time is when the murder clearance rate in the United States started to precipitously drop. And it's one of the things that I'm sort of most fascinated with true crime stuff. It doesn't get talked about enough. I've tried to talk about it a few times, but it's really centered around data, so it's not the sexiest topic. But there's a really great website called the Murder Accountability Project. Let me just pull it up right here. I think it's murderdata.org. And they track this data. Yeah, here we go. Murderdata.org. I'll pipe that into the chat in case anybody wants to check it out later, because there's also a great New Yorker story about this. There's always a great New Yorker story. Let me switch tabs to you here so I can show you what I am looking at. And what they eventually started out as is as a database to try to find uncaught serial killers. That's what the original purpose of this website was, Murder Accountability Project. Because this country's so weird about the way that it deals with data, but there's no centralized gathering from all the different states of all the murder data. And this guy who created the website, his name eludes me right now, but he is sort of like a journalist data hound. And he thought, if we had demographic data and information about like the MOs of all these unsolved cases, you could find, perhaps you could find clusters of cases that had shared demographic or MO, and see, like, find an indicator that there might be an uncaught serial killer. And they, of course, went on to identify a number of clusters, and this became super helpful. But along the way, like, this guy started noticing other trends in the data that he was gathering. And one of the big ones was that like in 1970 or so, and I'll bring up the graph here in a second, the clearance rate for murders was about 90%. So essentially 90% of murders got solved. The clearance rate and actually conviction rate, there's a little fuzziness there, but it's easier for them to track clearance rate. There's reports on the site that explain it if you want to get into it. But let me just click on the clearance rate tab here because there's a good graph. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time monkeying around with the graphs, but you can kind of see the general trend. And so from 1970 to around 2020 was when the clearance rate reached its lowest. It went down to about 50%, about a coin flip in 2020. There's a spate of a spike in murders around the time of the COVID pandemic. But it's pretty notable, don't you think, that like with all this extra technology that we have these days, all the cameras that are everywhere, DNA, just all the different advances in forensics, that law enforcement went from being able to solve roughly 90% of cases to roughly half in that 50-year time span. And the drop-off really started around the time that John Douglas was beginning his whole profile thing. And so in that sense, the justification for it becomes a little bit more clear, because I'm sure the people at the FBI and other major law enforcement agencies were grasping at straws for anything that might help them solve all of these murders that were going unsolved. So the question is, why? Like, what changed between 50, 60 years ago and today in terms of, I don't want to keep searching on here, in terms of why the clearance rate would drop. And I think at least every year, possibly more often, these murderdata.org or the Murder Accountability Project releases reports dissecting the data that they do have and offering their take on why it might be. One of the big things is demographics, because people are more transient. There's a lot of other factors there, but like in 1970, most of the murders that happened between people that knew each other. There was a personal issue that was the catalyst for the murder. And because of all the different changes in the way the population behaved between 1970 and let's just say 2020, it became a lot harder to solve murders because there wasn't such a clear line between the murderer and the victims. There's a number of other phenomenon that you could add to give you some more granular texture on why this might be changing demographics, the rise in sort of gang culture in urban areas, the flight from different populations from urban to suburban, making these populations more transient and less stable in their communities. I wrote down a bunch of stuff that comes out of the reports here. Increasing usage of drugs, all this sort of stuff. So what I think might have been happening with profiling and also with stuff like hair and fiber evidence, and there's a bunch of this kind of stuff they used back in the 70s and 80s that you'll notice that they don't use anymore, like bite mark evidence, which is something that also comes up in the book. There's a number of cases that John Douglas profiled that were solved with bite mark evidence, tool evidence, like tool mark evidence, where the FBI lab had all these different specialists that would say, oh, this was caused by this exact tool, or, this bite matches the bite of this defendant, or this hair matches, and they'd always use that sort of terminology. Douglas even uses it in the book, saying match. I mean, that's a pretty big deal in terms of the in terms of like a criminal case. When you say match, that's like something reserved for like DNA or fingerprinting. These things are nowhere near as certain, and the way that they came up with their error rates was just basically out of thin air. But so my point is that I think that they were trying to find a way to fit defendants into cases, right? Especially high profile ones. And so they needed something that sounded sciencey, that seemed like it could be legit, like profiling or hair and fiber, where they'd have these FBI scientist guys. They're all this talk of microscopy and the different taxonomy of way hairs bend, to come up with physical evidence that they were lacking in some of these cases. Like the Atlanta child murders is a great example, because the entire city was essentially desperate to find the killer, because every week, new young black kids would show up in the river, and they just, it was causing the whole city to freak out. So in that sense, you can sort of see the utility of, like, the cops this is a scenario. They figured that Wayne Williams was good for all the murders, but they didn't have the evidence. That's where something like profiling or hair and fiber would really come in handy. It's just one thought. And it's based on my impression on looking at a lot of these cases. I did FOIA requests back in the day for there's spreadsheets full of tens of thousands of these goddamn things. And yeah, it's kind of depressing. Anyway, that's sort of my theory there. And if you're interested in that, I recommend checking out Malcolm Gladwell's Dangerous Minds article, which I linked earlier in the chat. It's a really good primer on how silly profiling is. And so, went over the Atlanta child murders. And so I guess here are the to conclude. And if you guys have other stuff you want to talk about, I'm happy to do it. We can always take a peek at some other stuff, but referring to my notes because I had a way to conclude here. I get really thrown off when I start getting into the whole hair and fiber thing, because it's such a rabbit hole, and it's like one you never really leave. It's more like a rabbit warren full of rabbit holes. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the part that I had outlined for my conclusion was pretty much what I had just gone over about clearance rates in Douglas. We've talked about how he has all these psychopathic traits. I don't want to harp on that. I think we've pretty well established that. I have so much other potpourri from reading the book. Here's my copy of Mindhunter. Let me get to a full screen here. I want to show you this. It's so hilarious what I'm working with here. It's like battered. It was actually in a flood, and because I had it from years ago, and I, didn't want to actually order a copy. I guess I do have the ebooks, but like I like to interlineate my books, so like you can see all my like crazy. It looks like I'm a serial killer with this book, but I like to write on the page. Like I've just got notes on like every single page. It just kind of goes to show you the madness I've been going through. But I think it's helpful in sort of categorizing things for me, because I'm just sort of used to reading books. It's just I'm torn to like whether or not to like actually say it's like worth reading for somebody, because it is so nauseating, but it is kind of fascinating because this guy Douglas was in the middle of like so much stuff. There's a section in here where he talks, recounts his interview for the profiling with Edmund Kemper, fascinating serial killer, and he gets into the details of his crimes. Very vivid, by the way, like the way that Douglas describes it, things in very gory detail. It's one of the comments you'll often see in people reviewing the book, is just how heavy it is. Yeah, that's it. It's a great way to sum it up, Markeith. It's really kind of sickening reading it, and like one of the things that like really becomes agonizing if you like start getting into this sort of stuff is, you know, you want to have some sort of sympathy for Wade Williams, the guy that's been in prison all these years, because he looks like he might have been stitched up. And I'm not the first person to say that, won't be the last. It's a very common opinion amongst people who are familiar with the case. But then again, like there's a pretty good probability that he did at least some of those murders, you know. And it is my thinking on the Atlanta cases is that it was always a number of different perps, but yeah, he talks. There's a section where he talks to Manson. It's just basically like a who's who of all of like the real weirdo serial killers. Right, and you can see how that would appeal to him. Like one of the questions I have, Markeith, is like, how much was he even aware of the fact that like him in the profiling thing might have been being used or as like a sort of pretextual, like he has this sort of personality where I can believe that his ego just sort of led him there. And he, you know, who even knows how that all would have worked or shaken out. Like it, I think I mentioned this earlier, but there's like so many of these different forensics that developed during that era that I call folk sciences. And the reason why I call them that is because they are really not science. They don't use a scientific method, but they sort of use like little, like almost like a magpie where it takes a little bit from here, takes a little bit from there. And these guys sort of organically seem to develop these disciplines that seem like very rigorous. But there's a number of in the Inspector General reports that like basically took these things apart. And it's remarkable. They share these really interesting overlaps, like even in the way that they created error rates, you know, because that's like one of the things that you need if you're going to have a real science, is a way to validate it or a way to disprove it or a way to figure out like how often you might be wrong with some sort of confidence. And the way that these guys did it was like the same. It was always based on their personal experience. And you see this come up over and over and over again in the books, you know, where they'd say, this is literally how they did it. Yeah, that whole episode, it's just crazy. Where they would say, like, I've looked at 20,000 different hairs, right? And only twice have I not been able to match a known hair to another unknown hair. And so, therefore, the chances that this hair comparison is accurate is like, you know, isn't accurate is 1 in 10,000. They just basically use their personal experience and extrapolate that little set of data into what the entire error rate should be, not taking into account all sorts of different things like regional variations. You know, like if you're in one part of the country versus another, you're going to see like different types of hair from different ethnicities. Remember, we have our 3 main classes of hair: the Negroid, the Mongoloid, and the Caucasian. These guys are out to lunch, you know? And a lot of this stuff isn't totally dead. I mean, it's just they don't use it in court anymore because it's been so thoroughly discredited that they would lose. But I mean, a lot of the same precepts apply to forensics of today. It just drives me nuts. Yeah, there's just so much to follow up on. I feel like I've been it's always like a double-edged sword because like I feel like it's such great material that I have that I've felt like I should linger on it. It's just so interesting, sort of picking it apart. But on the other hand, it's like I don't want to stay too long in the Mindhunter world. And another thing that's interesting is that like people's general impression of Douglas. I think it's been hugely buoyed by the 2017 show. He's I think like the average person probably regards behavioral profiling as like a real thing and thinks that Douglas is like a very respected figure. But if you go into like unvarnished YouTube comment sections, like people's impression of him is not too far off from what I've been saying. Like he's a pompous ass, and it's just impossible to. He just can't help himself by, like, over and over again in the book. He talks about like all these accolades he got. Goes into great detail. One time he gets like sick in Seattle and has like some sort of major illness, and after he is helped greatly by the staff at the hospital, he gives them a plaque, and it's like, who the fuck does that, you know? But he's just, you can tell that those sort of like awards or external validation just means a ton to him. Oh, you know, one other thing I just want to talk about, I touched on this briefly before, but I guess this may be a good way to sort of round things out, is to develop what I was talking about earlier between the affinity between personality types of like a serial killer and law enforcement. It's really kind of fascinating because Douglas talks about this affinity going both ways, like that serial killers are often police buffs and want to get involved in the case, or like wanted to be in law enforcement, and that he, as this profiler, has this sort of unique line into the mind of the serial killers, the Mindhunter, as it were. And it's like, I don't know if he's just not conscious of what he's saying or can't see like how this reflects on him and the sort of insuperability of these two things, the serial killer and law enforcement. But it's really fascinating, and I've sort of been tinkering with like some sort of hypothesis about what this might mean in terms of Israel Keyes, bringing it back to where we started, and why he liked this book so much. Because again, one of the things about a serial killer that's a real flaw and can lead to things is something that came up in the conversation I had last week with Parker from Crime Cult and the Victoria Evans channel, who've done more work on Keyes than anybody, is that like serial killers will sometimes make these really dumb mistakes and get caught. And that's true with Keyes, where he was using this ATM card for like small ball money, and that's how they tracked him and caught him. And one potential explanation for that, I think is very good, is that these guys don't have the same theory of mind that we do. You know, they're not able to easily step outside of themselves and think how another person would see things from their perspective, right? That's like sort of their trade-off. Marquise is mentioning, is his need to prove himself stronger than the authenticity of his intellectual curiosity to get it right? Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, it's just something I don't know that I can answer that immediately, but it's something that I thought about like all the time, is like, what was going through this guy's head exactly John Douglas, in terms of the way does he know how strangely he comes off? He must on some level, but then again, if he is who we think he is, he doesn't have much theory of mind, right? He's not able to externalize into thinking about how somebody else might consider things. So, you know, again, with that example of the serial killer, like maybe making stupid mistakes because he doesn't, you know, he just has some sort of dysfunction in the way he thinks others perceive him. And again, that's a stunning overlap to John Douglas, who just can't get out of his own way and is always doing these like really inappropriate things. It's almost like some version of the way that somebody on the spectrum would react, but it's very different. But they have that sort of shared strain of like not getting social cues or understanding how other people see them. But then the advantage on the other side of that is that they're able to totally disregard the feelings of others and what sort of pain or unfortunate circumstances they might be going through. In the case of a serial killer, that they're putting them through, right? And so this is what I was thinking about, that connection. Over and over again, like I said, John Douglas is saying, you know, like Edmund Kemper would go to police bars and chat up police and become their friends so that he could learn about the investigation, or one of the tropes that you often hear that was basically created by Douglas and the profilers is that serial killers want to become involved and will try to become involved in the investigation, will offer up their help. And maybe the utility of Mindhunter in Israel Keyes is that John Douglas is, let's just hypothesize and say that he is a psychopath, but he's not like on a scale from like 1 to 10, he's like a 7 or an 8. It's more of like a garden variety psychopath that we see all the time. Like 1 in 20 people in the US or in the world is a psychopath based on estimates that you'll see from experts. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's just like so. It's something I've pondered about a lot, and it's one of the reasons why it's like I've been locked in goddamn John Douglas land for fucking weeks, and there's no respite from this guy. Like his voice was so strong in the book of being such a douche, even though he has a co-writer that probably did all the work, Mark Olshaker. I was like, I need to do something else. Like, I was finding ways. I was like going to the coffee shop to read it, trying to like change my environment. I was even like taking bus rides to places I would normally just drive to, just to find some way to like force myself to read this thing. And you know, because every time I'd read it, there's like this negative feedback loop where I'm taking notes and like having to go check out other stuff. And so I was like, I'll listen to the audiobook. Guess who narrates the audiobook? John fucking Douglas. He's everywhere in this goddamn thing. So anyway, to close the loop here, let's say John Douglas is like a garden variety psycho, like a 7 or an 8, some, you know, just a normal type of sociopath. And he writes this book, and in the beginning of the book, he even talks about how like, oh, a serial killer couldn't use this as a manual. It's not going to be useful to them. Maybe the real utility for somebody like Israel Keyes is that he can get some sort of translation of a theory of mind from somebody at like the lower baseline that would make sense to him, so that he can have some sort of understanding about how other people perceive him. Because it has to sort of filter through the whole psychopathic grapevine, I guess. You know, like if he just hears it from somebody who's totally not on that spectrum, there's such a disconnect. Again, the point that Parker was making in last week's stream, where, you know, you can't make this sort of assumptions. You can't use the same playbook like an interrogation that you would with a psychopath, a serial killer, as you would with like a normal person. So, you know, I was trying to lay some theory on him about, you know, why the police were doing a bad job. And he's like, you have to factor in that these guys are just totally different than the normal person in an interrogation. They don't have the same motivations. You know, they're, in DIY narration. Yes. Yeah, of course, John Douglas is, anytime John Douglas can even sniff at the limelight, he's going to be right in there. So anyway, that was sort of the theory that I came to, is that John Douglas, the serial killer buff who visualizes the thoughts and crime scenes of serial killers to translate who they are, it was the conduit the other way as well, where he was able to give a serial killer some sort of insight into the non-serial killer dynamic. And, you know, the way he talks about it, we read that excerpt in the beginning of the stream. It was like the first time he really sort of understood himself and realized, you know, that there's other people like him in the world when he read Mindhunter, which is fucking crazy, right? Like when you think about it in this context, it's like, holy shit, this is a serial killer manual, and not even necessarily so much a manual, but almost like a religious text. That's the way that Keyes describes it. Perhaps that's influenced by the fact that he grew up in a fundamentalist type background involving potentially terrorism, but that's another story. There's just so many things about this case, the Israel Keyes case and Mindhunter aspect of it, that just make you keep thinking about these issues, you know, the terrorism angle, What exactly was Keyes involved in? Was he sheep dipped? Because if you think about it, you couldn't have like a better profile for somebody to be like covertly moved into some special operations unit than Israel Keyes, because he literally had no birth certificate, no serial number, or no social security number when he went into the military. Like, how does that even work? Oh yeah, that's another case that I really. There's like almost too many weird cases that are like coming to a head right now. But yeah, Rex Heuermann. I think a lot of these guys do, and that was one of the things that I was led to think about, just in terms of why John Ramsey and the Ramsey family was so fascinated with that book as well. And they brought John Douglas in to do a profile on that case, or to somehow try to figure out the writer of the note. And I think it went sideways, as I'm sure a lot of his stuff does. Yeah, it's just kind of, I think like that's one of the things that's so interesting about the Keyes case too, is that they had some concentrated access to him, and like it's one of the first times, I don't know, maybe it's just sort of like that modern-ish era, but like where you'll hear like a serial killer like talking about the work of another serial killer, like how he idolized Bundy, Israel Keyes did, almost as if it's like a like a modern baseball player talking about how much he studied the swing of Ted Williams or something. It's kind of wild. One thing that just crossed my mind is I always love like really interesting media about this sort of stuff. I always love those sort of recommendations. And I was just, your comment, Kate. Yes, exactly. Red Raven Spirit. That's like how I first came across it and read it. It was like many years ago. In that context, it didn't quite hit the same as it did now. But there's a really great documentary called, I think it's called Collectors. You know what? It's on YouTube. I don't think it was ever like, I don't even know if it was ever really exhibited anywhere. I can find the link here. Let me stop sharing that. But it's about people like, I think it came out in like 2000, and it's about people who collect serial killer memorabilia. Yes. There's some, there's a couple in particular where it's like, yeah, this is one of the things that's so blinkered about in the true crime genre. Like, especially if you're like me, you sort of came to it through a professional avenue, because I was in paralegal and criminal law for like a decade. Is you always sort of wonder about the motivations of people that are like really into it. And that's a great sort of way of describing the general themes of this documentary, Collectors. Yeah, it's really obscure, but it's great. And so this is the kind of stuff, like, I just wanted to, I'll throw a link in the chat. This is the kind of stuff I'm always looking for. It's just like really fun, weird, obscure. Yes. Wow. Yeah, right on it. Red Raven Spirit. Yeah, there's the link to it. Right. The more organized killers want to elude authorities, Kate. And that's, you might have even asked this question, I think last week, but like about serial killers, like wanting to get caught, or we were talking about it sort of organized versus disorganized, in that whether or not Keyes was meticulous. And it's interesting because I think that there's some criteria that Douglas describes in his book that it seems like it could have some weight to it. One of the things that I think he says that made a lot of sense to me is his definitions of what a signature is in serial killers and what a MO is, a modus operandi. And basically what he says is that the signature is static. It doesn't change. And it's like the thing that the serial killer is has a compulsion to do, like maybe they asphyxiate their victims. And so it's like something they do that like makes it so they're putting themselves in jeopardy by staying longer at the scene to do this thing that they're compelled to do. Maybe it's some sort of sexual thing or posing the body. But a modus operandi is more, it has the ability to change, like because, maybe in one case, like something they do to like get into the house, they almost get caught. And so the modus operandi is sort of dynamic. I have notes on that somewhere. So maybe if people are interested, I can shuffle around for those. But I just wanted to say, like, there's some stuff that he says that makes sense to me. But then some of the categories, like, I think there's some disorganized and organized is like maybe again, it seems like there could be some validity to it. But I think most serial killers are really like kind of both in some respects, or it's like a continuum. It's not like a binary, but yeah, this documentary is so crazy. Maybe we should even watch it next week or something, because it's just a really interesting look at the true crime obsessives in an era before it like really kind of took over, like in 2000, late 90s, early 2000s, and it really sort of profiles a sort of connoisseur group of people that like buy artwork by and like John Wayne Gacy's stuff is featured in it. Sir Crimbley, bordering on hybristophilia. That's such a fascinating phenomenon too, Kate. And another one of those like weird things that I think about all the time is like what is like the evolutionary basis of hybristophilia. This is another really, God, this chat is like really, it's like, I think it's one of the reasons why I like doing these streams is because there's always really interesting and well-informed people in the discussions. But yeah, it totally reminds me of that Sir Crimbley. I always think of Keith Raniere like ripping off of like a lot of different stuff from Scientology. And there's a good description in American Predator about how, Keyes would adapt some of his strategies based on what worked and didn't work for people like Bundy, So they definitely learn, and that's a great example of like something like an MO in the classification of John Douglas versus signature. Keith Raniere, he's a piece of work, man. No, hey, no problem. I can filter through it, no problem. Yeah, there's I'm such a recommender of different things, but there's some great interviews with Rick Allen Ross, the cult expert, anti-cult expert, where he talks about his experiences with Raniere that are fascinating because he was involved in like, I want to say over 10 years of litigation with Raniere based on like the silliest of premises. Like some person took somebody who was in one of NXIVM's intensive classes, like leaked a binder of information about what NXIVM did. Yeah, there's some definitely like some downsides to like some of the older deprogrammer guys. Him and who's the other one? Steven, the guy with the bite model. I think they're sort of outmoded. But it's just interesting hearing him talk about his interactions with Raniere, and I think that they're sort of the way they classify it. Has a lot of overlap with what we've just been talking about here with profiling. Where they aren't really sort of relying on any sort of systematic review, but him just talking about what he observed from Raniere's personality. Where he'd have like these arbitration meetings with Raniere, where Raniere would just like tell him his life story. And there's a couple other cult researchers that I think have like a more systematic approach, like Janja Lalich has like a series of criteria that she uses for like charismatic leaders. And it's kind of amazing the amount of overlap. like the puffed up backstory with between like somebody like Keith Raniere and L. Ron Hubbard. Like they both have these like crazy claims they make about that are just like ludicrous on their face, and it's just so fascinating to think about like what sort of filtering these sort of things do. And I think there's probably a similar thing that goes on with serial killers as well, but where if like some, the people that end up following Raniere or an L. Ron Hubbard are self-selected, right? Because they make all these sort of crazy claims. It filters out all of the rational people, I guess. It's one way of looking at it. Yeah, maybe we should do a collector's stream because it's such a weird movie and not enough people have seen it. Like I always want to, anybody that's into true crime, like, have you seen Collectors? It's just so, it just has, it's almost like a, there's people that did like the one about the dog show, or like A Mighty Wind about the folk scene. Oh, John Atack. Yeah. He's a good researcher on Scientology. But The Collectors almost comes off as if it was like a mockumentary. Spinal Tap, those guys. Because it's just the personalities are just so florid, and the whole scene is just so strange, and it's just the filmmakers get all this great footage of. There's like a couple owners of like a serial killer art gallery. Yeah, John Atack's a cool guy, and he did some streams with Mike Rinder, rest in peace, before Rinder died, that are like essential viewing, I think, if you're into like the deep lore of Scientology, because Rinder was one of the only like higher level executives that spanned the eras between L. Ron and Miscavige. And it's just, Rinder was telling all these great stories about how he was out on the Apollo with L. Ron Hubbard in like the late 60s, early 70s, and how they kept getting chased out of countries. And yeah, that was really cool. So John Atack is definitely a great source, and sort of, I don't really know how he does on other platforms, but he should be getting way more viewers on YouTube because he's great. But I've been like ignoring Scientology because it's just got too weird. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Red Raven Spirit. Yeah, there's always like a weird aftermath of those things. Yeah, it actually might be like the way I could maybe add some value to it is just do a little bit of research on how everyone how things have shaken out since then, because now there's like all sorts of there's a whole sort of cottage industry in serial killer art and memorabilia, which is nuts to me, but so it's definitely worth checking out. It's the price we pay for living in a free-ish country. Yeah, it's a weird one. I mean, it definitely is for like a specific taste. Like if you're into these sort of morbid things, I think there's a good chance you'll enjoy it. Yeah, so I think it eventually coalesced into something resembling a point I was making, but that was really helpful for me, if nothing else, to sort of organize my thoughts, because I'm outlining a edited video about this subject right now. Yeah. If you look in like my like a year or so ago, I made some videos about Scientology. It was just like, I don't know, it is such a depressing, weird world, and I think it's one of those things that if you like spend too much time on it, it sort of rubs off on you. Like there's such a relentless inner focus in this ideology of Scientology, and that it's almost like a toxic ooze that L. Ron Hubbard created. That's still, yeah, it's just a really, I guess the good news is that there's really not that many. Yeah. And that is something that people often remark on, I guess, or I can think of a few different examples of some serial killers, like Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, who are like very gregarious and charming in a sense, in person. Yeah. And it's always like it's always people that are like at a low point, or God damn. I watched that documentary recently. Something about the Nickelodeon kids, was something on set or something, but the point I was going to make, Sir Crumley, is that like the people I feel the worst for are like second or third gen Scientologists. That's actually how I first got into it. Is in like around the same 2008 era, I was dating a girl who'd grown up in Scientology, and so I was like, holy shit, this is nuts. Yeah, Quiet on the Set. Thanks for Keith. That's a good doc. I never really watched Nickelodeon when I was a kid, but it still was very affecting. I mean, you can't help but sort of know about that whole world from osmosis. So I'm going to be working on trying to finish my video this week on Mindhunter, because I don't want to spend too much more time down that rabbit hole. So if you guys have any thoughts on like what to do for next week's stream, I'd like to avoid it if possible. Maybe, I mean, I'm not totally dead set against it, but maybe Collectors is a good idea. And the Quiet on the Set documentary is quite depressing because it deals with Hollywood abuse of kids in the entertainment industry. There's a lot of really interesting overlaps between that and true crime subjects, or stuff like the people that sort of really started digging on it, that are involved in like child safety advocates for actors, ended up, I think, having some sort of role in like the Epstein case, uncovering some of that info. Anyway, all this stuff ends up sort of folding back in on itself. But so I guess one thing that I'm really thinking about is maybe doing a collector stream, but just maybe do something off the wall next week for a stream. So yeah, I'm gonna end it here. That was really helpful for me. I hope it was at least somewhat entertaining, and I think it'll make for a good actual video where I can be more coherent, and having had the benefit of this dress rehearsal really helps. So I appreciate all of your input, and yeah, I haven't really done actual video, produced videos on Keyes yet. I've just done some streams, but yeah, I have done some other true crime stuff like John Bonet and the Ailson trials of anyway. But yeah, I appreciate that. I'm glad the algorithm sent you my way. And so next week we'll be doing something weird, something fun, maybe the Collector's documentary about true crime memorabilia. And if you have any suggestions, I was going to say, yeah, Ricada, that's another weird rabbit hole. I end up kind of like getting waylaid into all these different weird rabbit holes. That's sort of been my pattern as I get super into like different outlier communities, I think is the best way to describe it. Cults, true crime. Anyway, so I'm always definitely amenable to your suggestions, and I really appreciate all the great comments. Happy Sunday, as Kate says. I'm going to go get some lunch. It is 1:47 p.m. here in Alaska. It's been snowing, but it's not right now. And I'll take my leave and see you the same time next week.